And actually, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
Because I know me.
And so that's our life mission. That's the McShin's mission.
You don't have to understand my boundaries to respect them.
Well, no, I'm the president, co-founder of McShin, a person in long-term recovery from substance use disorders.
How do you go about fixing the damage in the trust between the family after you get out?
Okay, I gotta work on that.
Celebrating my 6 months. Didn't have cake.
Yeah.
Gosh, showed up.
Hey, thank you for joining us today on Get in the Herd. I'm your host, Raymond Ruybe, and today I'm joined by Tom Jackson, who is many credentialed, and I'll let him introduce himself right now. Tom, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us what you do and where you do it, et cetera.
Sounds great. Thanks, Raymond. Hey, first of all, happy Thanksgiving, everybody. I like your new opening. It's really cool. So my name is Tom Jackson. I use he, him pronouns. My day job is as a registered peer specialist at Western State Hospital in the Shenandoah Valley, although I am not here in any official capacity. I have to make that mini disclaimer. I'm also a person in long-term recovery. My last use of illicit substances was May 13th, 1991. And my last mental health crisis was in August of 2009. And I know we're going to talk about co-occurring stuff. And so that's a significant part of my both experience and professional stuff. And then the last couple of years, my passion is as an organizer with the Virginia Recovery Advocacy Project and with RAP's Inclusivity Caucus. I think that's everything. Greetings from Earlysville Forest near the Charlottesville Airport, where my godson, as you may be able to see in the background, just from the stuff hanging, just celebrated his 30th birthday, which was one of the biggest gifts of my early recovery, being asked to be his and his twin brother's godparent. I can't do a good godfather imitation, so I'm not going to try. But anyway, hi.
So I just want to add to your storied credential list that Tom was also my instructor when I went through my CPRS training through DBHDS, and so in many ways he's also my Yoda, for lack of a better term. I consult him as the guru of all things recovery. But I'm Raymond Ruybe. I'm coming to you live. Not live today, actually pre-recorded today from the McShin Foundation, where I am a certified peer recovery specialist and also work as the director of data and quality control. So, Tom, why don't you tell us a little bit more about VRAP?
Okay, well, congratulations on your promotion too, by the way.
Thank
That's
you.
pretty exciting.
And
you were also one of my most eager and and just great students too. It was really wonderful having you in the class.
What I'm hearing you
Virginia
say
Recovery
there,
Advocacy.
what I'm hearing you say there is I was a Luke Skywalker to your Yoda, and I'll allow it.
There we go.
That's good. I like it.
And it's funny because I was just watching a couple of episodes of the new Obi-Wan Kenobi series on Disney Plus today. They dug Ewan McGregor out of retirement, which of course made me feel old because he looks old. And if he looks old, I look ancient. But okay, Recovery Advocacy Project in Virginia chapter, Virginia State Organizing Team is part of the nationwide Recovery Advocacy Project, which is a grassroots based organization that advocates for change in recovery spaces, most specifically, of course, with the just outrageous overdose crisis that year to year, as of the most recent numbers, killed 108,000 people, most of them avoidable. If we do some pretty serious changes in how the recovery system works, and I hope we get to talk about that some. But also just advocating in general for wider access to support, less stigma and discrimination, and so on. Well, I think that's probably it in a nutshell. I hope I described it well.
Yeah, you described it perfectly. So let's talk a little bit more about what changes are being advocated for on the state level here in Virginia.
We're doing a couple of things. We did a lot of work last January and February with the legislative session, and basically got absolutely nowhere with a change in party in both the governor's mansion and the House of Delegates. Almost everything that we had been working on got shot down in subcommittee, sometimes with a 10-minute hearing, which was pretty disappointing. So we decided for at least the next year or two to focus on more community actions, some administrative actions, and so on. Almost all of it in the short term based around the fentanyl based poison drug supply crisis. It turns out now it's not just fentanyl. I did a thing on xylazine, better known as tranq, which is starting to pop up in Virginia too. It's spreading south from Pennsylvania, where the webinar I watched said 91% of the heroin that is tested in Philadelphia now has tranq in it. So, which makes it particularly scary because it does do some stuff with breathing, not the same way opioids do, but Narcan doesn't work on it. But
Right.
speaking of Narcan, two or three of the things we're doing relate to Narcan. One is, and this is based on an article in the Virginia Mercury that people could Google if they're interested. There's been quite a bit of a problem of dispensing Suboxone, particularly in very rural areas in Virginia, where pharmacists have basically misunderstood an old DEA memo that really threatens them or makes them feel threatened. That if they don't just dot all their I's and cross all their T's, dispensing Suboxone to people who desperately need it and want it, that they can get in trouble. And so, number one, we're working toward advocating toward the Virginia Board of Pharmacy that they need to let all pharmacists in Virginia know that, number one, that memo was retracted not very long after it was published, but the DEA never published the fact or never promoted the fact that they retracted it. So, and they have gone after some pharmacists, particularly in West Virginia. We're finding it's mostly chain pharmacies, local pharmacies in particularly southwestern Virginia generally know the prescribers, they know their customers, and it's not much of a problem. But with some of the chain pharmacies down that way, people are being asked questions like, well, what taper are you on? And things like that, which is a completely inappropriate question for a pharmacist to ask because we
Right.
know more and more people are on maintenance Suboxone, buprenorphine. Number one, and number two, it quite frankly is really none of their business.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing we're working on. Another is we were astonished to find out that even some progressive law enforcement agencies, officers do not carry Narcan with them, particularly in Charlottesville and Albemarle, where I used to live, and several of our state organizing team members live, where they basically refuse to do it, again based on totally erroneous information that that officers can get high from exposure to either fentanyl or carfentanil,
Right.
which again is a folk tale and a pile of crap.
Yeah.
As a friend of mine who is the chief of the Charlottesville Albemarle Rescue Squad was told in a training, you would basically have to stand in front of a pound of fentanyl with a fan going for you to inhale enough for it to affect you, number one. And number two, the symptoms that these law enforcement officers are reporting where they think they have been exposed to fentanyl. Fentanyl is an opioid. It slows your breathing, it slows you down, and it knocks you out. And these people, quite frankly, more and more evidence is they're having panic attacks. Some of it based on their anxiety about being exposed to the stuff.
Yeah. The fear of the thing becomes greater than the actual thing itself.
Exactly. And so that's another thing we're working on. We are, among other things, looking for some grant money to launch a Virginia-wide survey of law enforcement agencies to see what they're doing and what they're not doing, and try and make that more widespread. The next thing we're doing is the Virginia Department of Health Professions, in cooperation with VCU and Carilion in Roanoke, put together this just wonderful best practices guide on treating opioid overdoses in emergency departments, including things like involving peer support pretty much from the moment somebody walks in an ED, giving them 3 days worth of Suboxone, making sure they have a confirmed follow-up appointment within 72 hours. And there was a bill in the General Assembly in January that aimed to make that law in Virginia. And it was even backed by one of the Virginia hospital associations, and the new majority in the House of Delegates shot it down with a very brief hearing. And that was particularly disappointing and disheartening, because it was the doctors and the hospitals themselves that supported it. It wasn't just, us mere mortal folks. And so we're going to see what we can do kind of hospital by hospital, community by community, to do that.
Yeah, I've recently become a Revive trainer of trainers for the application of naloxone for anybody who's in the middle of an opioid overdose, and I'm shocked at how little most people understand what naloxone is and what its applications are for saving lives. And I've had questions like, well, isn't that a drug? Like, it's technically a drug. It's a non-addictive drug. It's used to save lives. And people think that, like, you're just walking around with heroin in your pocket, when it's actually quite the opposite. It can be frustrating, especially when we're talking about the politicization of people's lives, and just keeping them alive, in the hopes that they'll seek treatment, rather than forcing treatment upon them. And it's like, get treated or die. There's got to be a middle ground there. So tell me a little bit more about your lobbying efforts with the state assembly, the legislative assembly, and what you do there. How you do it, how you go about it.
Well, again, Nathan Mitchell, who was your predecessor as host, really was both McShin and Rapp's primary voice in Richmond. And basically for, I don't know, was it 6 weeks, 8 weeks, pretty much lived at the General Assembly and testified in person. I dropped in on a number of Zoom calls, because almost all the hearings this past January, February they were hybrid meetings, and so you could drop in on stuff from anywhere. I don't know what's going to happen this January, but again, we're really looking at a pretty narrow range of stuff that we're supporting. There's I can talk about something in the peer movement in a minute if you're interested. But I wanted to follow up one little thing on the Narcan stuff. I'm also a Narcan train the trainer. I've been trying to set up a staff training at the hospital at Western State for staff, who live in the community, and some of whom have lost family members to overdose. And we live in a rural area with a particularly high overdose rate. And, and I've even bumped into some administrative hurdles doing that. I think we're looking toward actually doing, sort of our own effort where, we literally might do it, RAP and another 1 or 2 advocacy organizations in the Shenandoah Valley, literally might do it in a tent in the parking lot, and let's leave the administration out of it totally. But, when you talked about, it's so many people don't carry Narcan, don't know about it, and have this, it's enabling drug use. My advocacy and even my personal recovery in the last couple of years, more and more and more are endorsing the philosophy of harm reduction, radically widening the pathways to recovery. I started out pretty much as not pretty much, 31 years ago, there were 12-step programs, there was therapy, there was aftercare, and that was pretty much it.
Hmm.
And you either did that or you didn't. And now there's just a staggeringly wide array of recovery programs. I'm also a smart recovery facilitator, and that has become one of the significant parts of my pathway to recovery. But the biggest principle, the harm reduction, is dead addicts don't recover.
Right.
Dead, and let's get rid of the word addict too. That's another part of all of this. Let's just talk about people who use drugs. Let's get
Hmm.
rid of the stigma. I still fall into saying addict all the time, but again, one of
Many
the
people do. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And it's why when I introduce myself as a person in long-term recovery.
Hmm.
I even sometimes do that in varying recovery rooms and sometimes get some nasty looks, but
I get the nasty looks all the time. I'm
they
used
can,
to it at this point.
yeah,
Yeah.
if
I'm not.
they ever, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, they could choke on it, but I do want to get back to destigmatizing, substance use and recovery for that matter. One of the key takeaways I had from my DBHDS training, which you led, was, we're more than just our diagnoses. That's just one part of who we are, and everything else contributes to the whole. I did want to talk a little bit too about, like, keeping people who are actively using alive is, through Narcan, through any means, medically assisted treatment. However, that's just part of, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You want to get people physically safe, psychologically safe. Self actualization's at the top of that pyramid, but sometimes people who are just unused to being around people with substance use disorder, or unfamiliar with what that entails, they sort of turn that pyramid upside down and think that self-actualization has to come first, and then
Right,
everything
right.
else follows. And that's not how it works. And it can be so frustrating sometimes talking with muggles about, like, hey, this is what it really needs to be like. So I'm sorry, I took
No,
you
that's
on a
great.
tangent there. Yeah.
No, that's fine. Let's follow that because
Hmm.
I love muggles. I never heard that before. Jan Brown at Spirit Works calls them civilians.
Sure.
That's her current term for them.
So long
So
as we don't
I
call them normies, because that
yes,
implies that we're
exactly.
abnormal, and I don't like
Yes.
that. So.
And one of my earliest counselor coworkers said normal is only a setting on your dryer, which I've always loved. Um, and maybe on my dishwasher. I don't, but I'm not sure. Anyway, oh, where to go with that? You know, yeah, I mean, there's just so much stigma toward, toward recovery. And if you've seen the Anonymous People, which McShin played a significant part in, that I still show all the time to clients at the hospital, the whole concept of anonymity and how that for the last, 30, 40 years has been totally misunderstood.
Mhm.
That it means, we have to kind of recover in silence, that we can't talk about the fact that we're in recovery. And really, the only thing that anonymity means is, I'm not supposed to raise my hand in public and say, hi, I go to this 12-step program and that 12-step program and so on, lest you characterize the program itself based on my view or views and experience in it. Um, and of course, also, not to identify anybody else who goes. But
Mhm.
that's the same of every program, Smart Recovery, Recovery Dharma, all of them, we all have confidentiality
Mhm.
policies. And as one of the wonderful guys in Anonymous People says, you drive by a church basement and there's 30 people outside smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee. And, duh, what the hell are they doing there? It's an
Bible
AA
study,
meeting.
obviously. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, right, right, exactly. It's an AA meeting,
Yeah.
So, figure it out. But one thing I really want to touch on what you talked about Maslow, because I just taught that last week. What McShin does and the other recovery community organizations and Oxford houses and so on do is, you all provide the most important part of Maslow's lowest level, which is a roof over people's heads.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, I've worked with so many homeless people over the years. And when you're worried about, where you're going to live, and especially, if it's hot, if it's cold, any of those kinds of things, it's incredibly rough. I can't say I know very many people that have managed to maintain successful recovery living in a car,
Right.
or living in unsafe housing, living in an unsafe neighborhood, all those kinds of things.
Yeah, you don't walk up to somebody who's living in an underpass and say, "Oh, it's time for you to work the 12 steps now," because that's the furthest thing from their mind. It's like, "Hey, how am I going to, be warm tonight? What am I going to
Yeah,
wear tomorrow? How do I clean myself? How do I
yeah,
eat?" Those are
yeah,
things that become, more important. I want to get back to what we were talking about, with anonymity. To me, anonymity is, not about me talking about my own, co-occurring disorder with substance use and mental health, because obviously we're doing that right now,
right.
out to tens of thousands of people. But
Whew, now I'm scared.
oh yeah, good, good. That was my intention. But it's about, me not outing somebody else in
Right.
the process. Like, I'm not going to talk about this person or that person and what they might be going through, or God's forbid, like, I talk about a participant in one way or another. I wouldn't do that. That's just basic human
Right.
decency.
Yeah.
Um, and that sort of brings us to our larger topic on the issue of co-occurrence. Again, more than just what our diagnoses are. I mean, I've been living with epilepsy for, geez, almost 35 years now,
Mhm.
and that's just a small percentage of who I am. And my substance use at one point or another, that's also a small percentage of who I am. I'm more than some of my parts.
Mhm.
And
Absolutely.
yeah, we all are.
Yeah.
Everybody out there, you are too. Yeah, I can pigeonhole myself and just say, well, I'm this or I'm that or I'm gay or I'm this. But hey, that's just all of the contributing factors into
Yeah.
what makes a person. Um, you want to
Yeah.
talk a little.
Exactly.
You want to talk a little bit about what co-occurring disorder, like, what co-occurring means to you.
Mhm. Sure. I mean, at its basic level, co-occurring just means two or more things happening at the same
Sure.
time. And in my case, it's a combination of ADHD that goes back to the age of 2 or 3. I literally am a nursery school and kindergarten dropout. I was expelled from both. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, when they didn't know what the hell to do with me. It was funny. I was in New York for Clinton Global Initiative with some of the rap folks, and on our way to the first day, we literally drove by the nursery school I was tossed out of, which I thought was kind of funny. But anyway, and then depression based on, in particular, the trauma of being bullied, for being the sort of slight, new kid in the country who moved from New York. Sort of my own internal stigma against knowing from a pretty early age, that I was gay, especially in an environment, again, in rural Eastern Connecticut.
Hmm.
But even growing up in New York, and I gave my parents a lot of crap about this as I grew up and came out to them. We had gay friends, we had gay relatives, we had lesbian friends, we had lesbian relatives, but they never talked about it. It was
Yeah.
just my two aunts who had been together for something like 47 years by the time the first one of them passed on. They were roommates.
Hmm.
You know?
Yeah.
Uh,
Sure. Best friends.
yeah, right. No, they owned a house together. They built a house together. Everything. But anyway, so that was almost my first exposure to stigma and discrimination.
Hmm.
And it's interesting. There's a guy author by the name of Walter Detz who wrote a book on particularly gay men's experience called Out of the Shadows. And we talk about trauma. We talk about adverse childhood experiences contributing to. He says people who grow up gay in America are exposed to at least one adverse childhood experience, which is society looking down on us.
Hmm.
Number two, a lot of us have religious trauma based on that. And number three, an awful lot of us have family trauma based on that. So, one of the things when you think back about it, the much higher incidence of substance use, suicidal ideation, suicide, and so on, in young gay, lesbian, and trans people, is due to the fact that we've got 1 to 3 more adverse childhood experiences than we're starting out with those.
Sure.
And then you get all the other ones of other kinds of family trauma and so on.
Yeah.
So anyway, one of the ways I describe it, and I told my story in my peer class last week, and I keep getting light bulbs going off still, after 31 years in recovery, I still have light bulbs going off about my experience. But I've said this for a while, I think if I hadn't started using drugs and drinking and smoking cigarettes all in the same weekend at the age of 14, there is a good chance I would have killed myself. I mean, that's how bad the depression was. It was how bad the bullying was, and so on. And, and I fell into a crowd all of a sudden of people who were also doing the same thing. And until I got to college and met some, more mature functioning people, one of whose house I'm in right now, who I've known for well over 40 years. And needless to say, even in that environment, in the mid 1970s, most of us were far from sober. But anyway, I mean that use and so on was was a substantial part of my not killing myself at a young age. And of course, the difference is, and this is where the stories we hear in recovery rooms all the time is, well, at some point the disadvantages became bigger than the advantages, which is pretty much my definition of addiction. And I didn't stop. I kept doing it for another, I don't know, 17 years, something like that, 16 years, until, the bottom fell out. I don't use, again, another change in language. I don't use the phrase hitting bottom, because I think it implies that you pretty much have to be, living in the gutter, in a trench coat, clutching a bag of, a pint of bourbon in a brown paper bag, to start in recovery. And we know that's not true. We know that you can start anywhere, anytime, where all of a sudden your brain goes, this isn't working, and there's got to be a better way.
It's also such a subjective term too. Like, what does that mean? What you consider hitting bottom might be completely different than what I do. And
totally.
what anybody else out there listening to this podcast might be. And then we start to judge one another based on our perceived differences, right?
Yeah.
Oh, that wasn't so bad. And what's that going to do? It's going to lead somebody to go back out and use some more.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Hey, so-and-so, so-and-so started, they got all the way to, whatever, the 10-mile marker, and I got off the freeway at 5. Hey, I can get back on and go to 10.
Sure. Yeah, they can do it. I can do it too.
Yeah, and these days, of course, and again, and this is, while, in some ways I don't have any significant, sort of first degree experiences with people dying from, from poison drugs. Everybody I know does. And so in some ways, while I'm doing advocacy for stuff, I feel a little weird about it, because, but my circle of friends and coworkers and so on, by and large are either in recovery or are muggles. And so, but everybody I know, I mean, every week, a coworker loses somebody. Every week, somebody, one or more of the people who are involved with rap lose somebody. And so, I certainly experience and feel it, if not directly, but sort of one degree of separation out. Let me go back a little bit to stigma and so on. A couple of people, Bill White in particular, who is sort of the historian of the recovery movement and is in the Anonymous people a lot, and who I actually hope to meet. I'm going to be in Florida in January, which is where he lives now, and I'm hoping maybe I can get to meet him. He's always been an inspiration, and I'd love to meet him sometime. But we talk about language and how critically important language is. And even in some cases, more than in the substance world, in the mental health world, which is where I spend 8 hours a day, the stigmatizing language there, we've been trying to work on for 20 years. And we're still, still struggling, especially with clinical staff, and we've done language trainings in, grand rounds at the hospital over the years and things like that, and the younger generation coming up is a lot better about it. But, I still have, staff I work with who will call somebody, oh, they're a schizophrenic, they're
Mhm.
a borderline, they're a this, they're a that. If I can get them to say they are a person with XYZ, I feel like oftentimes I'm 80% of the way there, and I'll worry about the other 20% on a case by case basis. We are still just in the last year or so making progress in renaming groups from substance abuse groups to substance use groups. And I'm sometimes I correct people when I'm working with them, staff when I'm working with them, to try and change substance abuse to substance use. The DSM eliminated it 7 years ago, 8 years ago, something like that.
Mhm.
Uh, and the world has not caught up yet.
Sure.
There is no substance abuse and substance dependence anymore clinically. It's substance use disorder. And so, and it's interesting because again, one of the things that Bill talks about, and John and Carol talk about a lot, and they were, all intimately involved with the founding of Faces and Voices of Recovery, which did some surveys 20 years ago on language and how it impacted people. And Jan Brown did a talk at the VCU conference in April, kind of updating some stuff and talking about it, where people hear the word addict and alcoholic, and they of course assume people are still using. But even
Right.
half the time they hear the word recovery, they think people are still using
Yeah.
substances or whatever. And so, again, we still just have a massive journey to keep going on in terms of changing language. And if you change people's language, you change their thoughts.
Right.
That's sort of basic cognitive behavioral therapy, among other things.
Yeah,
Um,
and in lieu of providing cognitive behavioral therapy to all of America, though, I think we we talk about the word addict, and I think a normal assumption for people who aren't in recovery is to say, well, if they're an addict, it means that they're addicted to something, like they're
yeah,
they're
yes,
actively using
yeah,
something.
yep,
But in the recovery world, we use the word addict to say that we were addicted to something,
yeah,
or that we're
mhm,
passively addicted to something, but we're taking steps to doing something about it. And the disconnection happens between those two uses of the word addict.
yeah,
And that's why we need to destigmatize, use destigmatization. I introduce myself as a person in recovery.
yeah,
Um, that's how I choose to do it. I think that that's a clearer statement than saying an epileptic or an
yeah,
addict. It's so much more of an umbrella term. There is some concern though from everyone that the more that we use ambiguous language like in recovery and not be specific about it, that then begins to water down the term, and it could mean so many things that it starts to begin to mean nothing.
yeah,
I don't follow that. I'm just playing devil's advocate by bringing up
yeah. No.
that counter argument.
Well, I
Yeah.
think there's even an interesting point that Jan Brown made in her talk, which is, the big book, its subtitle is how we recovered, not
Hmm.
how we are recovering.
Right.
From day one, AA used the phrase recovered, but then, in meetings, we're told, God forbid you should use the word recovered because, you're jinxing yourself. You're going to be an addict or an alcoholic forever. All of this stuff, and we go back to like medical criteria. I don't meet diagnostic criteria for any substance use disorder anymore.
Hmm.
Um, you know,
Right. Yeah.
which is
Not
why,
neither one of us would.
yeah, which is why, sometimes I will say, I have recovered from, a number of different things. I have other stuff I'm still in recovery from. And I have some other stuff that I'm still struggling with. Uh, let's be honest.
Yeah. I,
Powerless over Coke Zero. Uh,
it's funny that you bring up the word powerless because I want to bring it back to the big book. The word powerless is only used once in the big book, and it's in the past tense. And
Yep.
then we live in a society, in a recovery society now. I've gone to so many meetings where people are like, "You're powerless now. You're going to be powerless forever." But the whole purpose of
Yeah.
using the word powerless in the past tense is to say, "No, you have power now. You made a choice
Yeah.
this morning. Continue to make the right choice. It's completely up to you." But some folks here have heard that word and they use it almost to mean, that powerless is ubiquitous um, with recovery. And to me, recovery is the opposite of powerlessness. It
Yeah.
is self-empowered.
Yeah.
It's being empowered to do the right thing, to better ourselves, to move in a more forward direction, as opposed to constantly
Yeah.
being mired in one place. And
Yeah. I mean,
it's fascinating, really. Sometimes we create our own stigmas, right, within the
oh,
recovery community.
absolutely. And the thing I forgot to say was that Bill White in particular is trying to get rid of the word stigma,
Hmm.
and replace it with the word discrimination,
Yeah.
which is what actually happens. You can stigmatize me, but that's a feeling in your head. That's a thought or a feeling. But then you discriminate against me. That's the action.
Hmm.
And which of those kind of chicken or egg things, but the end result is you were discriminating against me.
Right.
But yeah, and I work with a lot of people who have just awful trauma histories. I mean, in 20 years of doing the work I've done, Stephen King couldn't come up with some of the stuff that people I work with have experienced.
Yeah, that was an
um
uncomfortable laugh, by the way, because
yeah. Oh,
I'm
no, that's
familiar. Yeah,
fine. No,
I
of
know.
course. That
Yeah.
Yeah. But working with people with trauma histories in particular, and here we're talking about co-occurring stuff, because almost everybody who has a substance use condition has experienced trauma. Again, almost by definition, we
Yeah.
know we know that substance use, by and large, is a genetic predisposition, which, depending on who you listen to, is anywhere between 30 and 50% of the population. um, and then life experience, and most of that life experience that kicks off active substance use disorder, or substance use conditions, is some type of traumatic event. Again, in my case, it was bullying.
Well, can I add
But
to that too? That sometimes
yeah,
just the act of becoming involved in recovery can also be a traumatic event. You have some folks who have only known drugs and alcohol for so long that
yep,
to them it's the greatest love in their life, and you've just asked them to dump that love of their life and never go back to it again. How in the hell are they not going to
yeah.
feel trauma from
Well,
that? Yeah.
Well, and I would even go beyond love. Again, that the way we now know substances affect our brains, it's survival. It's not even
Hmm.
love anymore. It's survival. Our brains are convinced that they need these substances on a regular basis for our survival. And rewiring that takes quite a while. Of course, we know it happens.
Yeah.
Uh, and again, and then we talk about providing the basics of life and starting there, and then rebuilding a new life. I mean, obviously we have to replace all of that energy, all of that effort, and all of that dopamine with
Hmm.
something more positive. um but I totally forgot what I was going to say. I do it all the time now. Don't get old, it's not pretty.
No,
um
it beats the
but
alternative, though.
Yeah, I suppose. Uh, you know, uh, but again, oh, I know what I was going to say. When you're working with people with a trauma history, and you use the word powerless, you are really diminishing their potential for recovery and so on, because the one of the biggest things that people recovering from trauma need to do is take power and control over their current lives, because the trauma took the control, took the power away from them. It's also the word control. We get
Hmm.
told all these stigmatizing things about the word control in some recovery programs. And one sort of an aside, I know staggering numbers of people with trauma histories who are working the steps, get to the fourth step, get told they got to write all this stuff down, dig deep
Mm-hmm.
without any quite frankly, my recommendation usually is professional support.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you have a serious trauma history and you're doing a fourth step without some type of trauma support from a trained trauma specialist, the people who have a recurrence of use, again, another term for replacing relapse, is just off the charts, because you're experiencing this trauma with no padding. You have no insulation anymore. You've taken away the substances which allow you to live with your history of trauma day to day, and you haven't replaced it with anything yet. You know, if sponsors aren't trauma therapists, if they are, they're not following their professional ethics, because a trauma therapist is a trauma therapist and a sponsor is a sponsor,
Right.
and so on. And so, again, and I think that's a perfect example where we still have silos, staggering silos between substance use and mental health. And I work in both areas. I'm a board member of our local NAMI chapter, and of course do work in substance spaces too. And at the funding level, at the research level, and everything, everything is siloized.
Mm-hmm.
And there is very little, there's very little funding. There's very little even accommodation between the two worlds, where, and I'm going to use stigmatizing language. The junkies don't want the crazy people, and the crazy people don't want the junkies. Let's use,
And the
and that's
alcoholics
kind of
don't
what
want
it,
either.
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Right. Yeah. So, I was including alcoholics, but anyway, yeah, exactly. And we're everything. Substance use disorder is a mental health condition,
Yep.
among other things. Now, I started working in the field 20 years ago, and 10 years, and we have made progress, because 10 years before that, my mentors, directors, and so on, who were still friends, would talk about their experience, where if you walked into a community service board, and said, I'm hearing voices, and they're bothering me, one of the first questions would be, well, are you using substances? And if you said yes, they'd say, well, go get sober and come back in 30 days.
Mm-hmm.
And how many of those people died in those 30 days? I don't know. That brings us to one of our other advocacy things. I do want to talk about same day access,
Mm-hmm.
and make sure from an advocacy standpoint I bring that up, because that's a huge both personal and rap priority. But even, yeah, and it's it's gotten better. It's gotten better. But there are still facilities that treat one that really don't do much for the other. In some ways I'm really fortunate, because more and more people, more and more of the clinical staff I work with at the hospital are completely co-occurring aware.
Mm-hmm.
We don't do much substance use treatment. We're not a substance use facility. We're a mental health facility.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're there. That's what to a significant degree, that's what we're there for. Now, we've got a great program I work on, which diverts people who have a significant substance use condition from the hospital to treatment, which is really well funded, and so on, which is one of my favorite things I do at work. But again, yeah, and how many people go to treatment for substance use, and they walk in the door and they say, well, I have trauma I need to deal with, and they're told, well, get sober first, and then you
Yeah.
can deal with the trauma. Well, to what degree, very specifically, are flashbacks, nightmares, all all of depression, all those kinds of things, causing them to use substances because they haven't learned any other treatment for those conditions.
Right.
And, and so, they're SOL too. And again, that's why advocating for this is just so critical. We know surveys show 50 to 66%, half to 2/3 of the people who have one condition have the other. Those of us who do the work would probably say it's well over 80.
Yeah.
And so how can you not treat both?
Right.
How can you not treat both?
Well, you'll find me in what my grandmother used to call violent agreement on this one.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. So Tom, any closing thoughts before we
Oh,
wrap?
wow.
Yeah.
Woo! We've been talking for what, like 45 minutes? That's amazing.
Yeah,
This
a
is
little longer, I
Yeah,
think.
yeah. Let me talk about same-day access
All right.
because it is just such a critical issue. STEP VA, which is the retooling of the Virginia mental health system, which has been underway for a number of years since the incident Senator Creed had with his son, calls for same-day access. Now, let's talk about what that same-day access really is. If you go to a CSB and you get there before 2 or so, most days, you'll get an assessment.
Mhm.
Okay. You were then told that the goal of STEP VA is to get you actual services within 10 days, calendar days. Now
Right.
we know, and this is based on some surveys I saw that were, I can't talk too much about them because they were confidentially done, but we know that there is a huge drop off every day, every calendar day between assessment and services. Anywhere between 10 and 25% of the people are just not going to come back. And so two things happen. They are at huge risk these days of overdosing and dying, which is something that we want to try and start seeing if we can quantify that to
Mhm.
make some change at the system level. But also, if they're not dying, they're at least miserable,
Right.
and so on. And there's an increasing push right now. I just found out about this week with Department of Behavioral Health, the Medicaid folks, Department of Medical Assistance Services, to include some significantly increased peer services along that pathway where, our dream is that you walk in, you'll get an assessment, but you will also get peer support that day, and that peer will follow you on a daily basis if need be until you get the clinical services that you also need.
Right.
And we know that that will, number one, keep people from dying, keep people from being miserable, prevent hospitalization, which is another huge thing because we know that in Virginia, our hospitalization system, our emergency crisis system, and so on, is basically a train wreck. People sitting in emergency departments now for 3 to 7 days waiting for a psych bed somewhere. With kids and adolescents, it's even worse. With no treatment at all, sitting in a sterile room, so they won't hurt themselves,
Right.
or so they don't have access to hurting themselves, and no treatment. They might get meds, but they're not going to get anything beyond that. And a lot of that could have been treated in the community if they could have gotten in sooner, seen sooner, supported sooner, and so on. So, my sort of pipe dream is, and this happens in other states. Virginia is probably 10 years behind the curve on doing this compared to some of the more progressive states. You walk into a CSB, which are full of caring people. Many of whom I've worked with I worked with one for 16 years. Are full of caring people, but they need the support of, in particular, the peer population to assist them in providing far more wraparound services that will save lives and help people recover.
Yeah.
That's my final pitch. Thank you for letting me make that.
Hey, you bet. 24 hours can
Mm.
seem like an eternity to somebody when they're seeking help,
Oh,
especially
absolutely.
especially if they're unfamiliar with recovery and what recovery is, or if they're in the middle of a mental health crisis. I want to thank you so much, Tom, for joining us today. I hope we can do this again soon. And I know you and I are going to continue to talk anyway. I want to thank all of our tens of thousands of listeners and watchers out there. Again, I'm Raymond Ruybe, and thank you for getting in the herd.
Yeah, can I do my one last pitch?
Yeah, go ahead.
Come to our Facebook page, Virginia Recovery Advocacy Project, or go to recoveryvoices.com and find us there. And we'd love to have you at a state organizing team meeting. Thanks,
Right.
Raymond. I really
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Sure thing.
Bye.
But the ladder is going to burst a bit.
Is
Hey,
that a
Tom,
wrap?
yeah,
Is that a wrap?
yeah. Raymond had to use
Cool.
the restroom, so he ran out.
Yeah, I'm kind of right there myself too. So, hey, thanks. This was great. This was fun.
All right.
I hope it comes out okay on